Um, Going on to the first one, when I got my master's degree, I got it in watercolor, and I was lucky enough to study under William Murray and William Unger, both down at now what's called Truman State University, and the two of them worked with me a lot, and Mary Bell Martin worked with me a lot, and on watercolor techniques and fashion and putting things together. And so when they worked with me, they taught me a lot of different skills, and each one of them had a different philosophy of watercolor. One was very abstract, one was very realistic, and the other was very European. And so between the three of them, they gave me a lot of background, and each one, when I get a piece of work done, one would say it was great, and the next one would say it was a piece of trash, and so I'd have to work until I got one going. When I got my MA degree, the major emphasis was watercolor, and the minor emphasis was in silkscreen or serigraph. And so it gave me a lot of experience to mix the two together and go with them. That's the one regret I have tonight, is I don't have any printmaking here. Now I'm going to do another show later, and in that one I'll have a lot of printmaking, a lot of serigraph, a lot of relief printmaking, things like that. But tonight I was focusing mostly on watercolor and acrylic or oil, and so that's what you see mostly tonight. So this watercolor, I wanted one, and you got to understand, in my watercolors I work mostly illusion. I'm very abstract, and so I work mostly with illusion. And if you pay attention to it, the name of this one is called Iowa, and so it kind of speaks for itself. The sky and the snow, they disappear together, kind of like the ocean. Only we don't have to go to the ocean; we have it right here. And we can make a landscape disappear into the sky. We can make things seem fairly stark. And if you were an outsider to this region, to Iowa or the Midwest in general, you'd think this is very harsh. But to us here, this is a beautiful contrast, a beautiful sequence, and it's not all that dangerous or isolated or faulty. I like to use the old farmhouses. I like to pull them off, and that's done with pulled paint, and so working with that area. The evergreens are symbolic because when you see trees, especially in northern Iowa, and that's where I'm from originally, up around the Webster City area, when you see trees, they were planted there by the settlers because they weren't there to start with. And so I always kind of stick some trees in there that might look like they were introduced and not just natural. The rest of it kind of comes off as a fence row. Moving around to the next piece of work. This is just a pencil drawing to study. It's actually a twig that was about 4 or 5 inches long, and I just enjoyed drawing it. And then I wanted to do a ground reverse problem by putting a square behind it and pulling off the stick to make it stand out. And so I changed the ground, and so the stick became the ground, and the background became the foreground. Going into the next one, and down here is just a study of textiles and mixtures and balance, and that's what I wanted to work with. I was working with students at this particular time. I teach for DMAC, and in the design class I was working with, I was working with the problem of balance, because this is non-art majors class, and so they run into a question of what is balance, what is heavy and what is not heavy. And so they think everything must be symmetrical. Well, I needed to break up the idea of symmetry. And as a result, I wanted to show them that weight could be a balance. It also could be a breakdown of textures or textiles or whatever. And so that's how I get that. And again, I do with the ground reverse. This one here is a construction canvas or a collage, if you'd rather. And this is very sentimental to me. I found the violin in a box. It's all broken in pieces, and so I rebuilt it, and then I had to carve some new pieces to it. And then my mom saw it, and so she was quite the musician, quite the pianist and organist, and so she took violin lessons with this and made it so it played really pretty music. And Mom got arthritis and could no longer work, and Mom died a couple years ago, and so I got the violin back, and this is called Mom. And it's what I remember of Mom, and that's why this is one of them that's not for sale. This is one that I keep for me, but it's one that's I like it. I think I've worked with a lot of this type of canvas anymore. And philosophically, when you walk into a room of a house, each room is a construction canvas. Each room, like this show, is a painting, and you compose it just like a painting. This particular show happens to be a logarithmic composition. You walk in, it's a snail shell, and you follow it around, and that way you don't exit the situation. So one piece leads to the next piece, leads to the next piece, and on down around the line. And so it gets a kind of a growth thing. So that black and white piece goes, and your eye goes to this, and then you pick up that, and you keep moving around. It places where your eyes stop and moves, and that's intentionally the way we've hung it. But in my house, or in anybody's house that I ever get to play with, when I do a room, it's like this painting, or like this collage. It is its own painting. It's a canvas. And each room is set up as a canvas. The walls are set up as canvas. The furniture, you set it up so it becomes a piece of art. And so it's the same arrangement. This is a photograph. I've gotten to where I've done more photography since I retired from teaching. I've done more photography than anything else. And my daughter and I even have a business in it. And I happened to have the ice storm a couple years ago, and I like to go out and play with it. My downside about this is the focal point is not as strong as I wanted, but it comes off looking nice, and I like the monochromatic, or the achromatic composition of it. This piece of work happens to be one of my favorites. It's one I just did about 2 weeks ago, and I was just playing with the idea of watercolor and what I could do in the background. As you can see, I scraped with a knife and took pieces of work off. I threw salt on the watercolor while it was wet, and it spread out and made kind of a flaky-like area. I went in with a wide brush, took this in, scraped some more, and when I got through, then I went back in with it. And when I do detail with a watercolor, I use a palette knife often. And what I did was draw the trees in there, and to give it the actually, it's a kind of a relief, because I as much as I like to work with abstraction, when people look at the work, they need to see sometimes something they can identify with. In this particular case, I thought it worked, and I thought it came together. It made a nice feel. The two death masks, they make a mold out of a person's face, and you have to, and from that you take clay and put into the mold and make features with it, and then you work from it. I wanted the turn of the century 1900 type girl, and so we worked with this one, just put it on thing and just glazed it relatively flat, and did some things with it, and that's what this is implying. I've always had a thing about the American Indian, and I've always had a I don't know what you call it, what do you even call it, a kind of a passion for things that are Western, and especially historically Western. And so that works with it. Even to the point where there was a period of time in my life when I went to summer rendezvous with buckskins, and I still have a trade musket that I use. And so, and I have the powder horns hanging around the house and stuff like that. So that appeals to me in my entire life. Since I was a small child, the American Indian, the Native American, has been an appeal for me. In between them, this is a scratch board, and now my passion often is dealing around nature and what we have and around our environment, things we can pick up, things we can use. I'm a hunter. I'm an avid hunter, and we go shed hunting in the spring, and sometimes we find these things that are left, the deers drop them off, and we use them, and so that's why that's called shed. But that's a scratch board. It's just a study of the knobs and the textures. It's just something that appealed to me when I was looking at it. I thought, well, let's try a drawing. Okay, going down to this. This is a stick drawn with a stick, and it was a design problem. I all the way through my teaching career, I'd go back to school periodically and take more classes. And so this is a drawing class I took by Richard Higgin up from Iowa State University, and he had us take and lay the paper on the ground and hold the stick in our hand, and we had a long stick, and we dip it into the inkwell and draw the stick by looking at it and drawing it on the thing. So we had to draw a long distance, and it's kind of a disciplinary thing to learn how to handle things with less control, and how to see things and render it down. So this one has always appealed to me. I like it. I like it because it comes off a lot of dots and things, and it comes off is one of my favorite pieces. Moving on to this one. This could be any ditch, any place in the Midwest. I just wanted to work with the concept of depth. Again, you see the watercolor influence, even though this is an acrylic. You see the watercolor influence. It's on stretched canvas, and I wanted to just show depth in the timber. And this is one of those, like I said, this is one of those places you can see anywhere. But mostly I was after this. What happens behind the immediate trees that you see? Where do they go? What do they do? So that's what I was working with on that one. Again, I've gotten where I play shadows a little bit. I'm still pretty much of an abstract painter, and this is pretty abstract, but it does show some watercolor influence and does show some technique that I've picked up over the years. Going to the next one, again, a long time ago, a teacher told me if I was going to live in the Rocky Mountains, then to paint the Rocky Mountains. If I was going to live in the desert, then to paint the desert. And if I was going to live in the Midwest, paint the Midwest. I've learned to do that. Paint where you live, paint where you know, paint where you have a passion. And if I had a passion for those other places, I'd move there and I'd paint them. But since I live here, this is what I work with. And so this could be any given Midwestern area. Again, the evergreens are symbolic of the modern man's, when he settles an area, the first thing he does is change the botany of the area. Okay, going on to the next one. I got my master's degree in watercolor, like I said, and this minor in serigraph. But as I've gone on to more classes later on and continually studied, because every summer I'd go to some place and take something, I found that design became my passion. And I was more interested in the design and the structure of a thing and the plan of it all than I was in the reality of it or the realism of it. And so this is pure design for its own sake. It's non-objective. It has no symbolism whatsoever. It's just shapes and things and planes going where I want them to go. And because of this, I like this. I really, when I get to where I'm doing my own work, much of it is very much broken down into just being a study of planes and a study of overlapping. Okay.
Okay.
Going into this one, I guess we're going to just go around. Going into this one, I've always been interested or fascinated by mathematics, and this is the mathematical sequence of phi. It's a 1 to 6.18 ratio, and so what it amounts to is you can see how it's broken down into particular lines. I've broken it down. Even the canvas is made to that kind of a ratio, and so the whole thing is broken down, and that's all the sequence is. And these are simply to pull things together so they don't become isolated, or one area becomes more important than the other. But it's a mathematical equation, and that's all that painting comes down to. For me, it became very, very strong. It became very much of a personal statement. Moving over to this one. This is the last piece of work I did before this show. I did this and finished it Thursday night about 9:30, and I'm always intrigued by the concept of trying to make things look photographic. And so that's why I call this one trompe l'oeil. It means to fool the eye. And I'm not going to tell you how I did it, but I am going to say that this does come up to the expectations that I had. It worked and it fell together. And it is the idea of fooling the eye. Because when Frank mentioned the other day, he thought it was a photograph at first. Well, that's what I intended for it to look like. It could be a little aluminum foil or it could be a crumpled up piece of paper. That's the intent. And so but as you can see, it is a painting on canvas. Stepping into the middle, I'm teaching a watercolor class coming up for the gallery here. And one of the first things we'll teach will be how to control watercolor and how to set up design and how to set up composition. So what I'm doing is breaking things down into geometric planes and then putting a representational shape inside, and then from that point controlling the paint so that it stays flat and so you work one plane at a time. That's the whole point of this. This photograph is purely accidental. It's just I was out in the Black Hills. I was in the Badlands, and it's just at sundown. And so I kept sneaking around this mountainside, trying to get or mountainside or whatever you call that, around to get that sun just right. I like the way it played, and so that's the whole point of that particular photograph. This is the oldest piece of work here. My father-in-law and I found an old barn. I mean, actually, we didn't find it. It was on a farm that we owned, and this was done back when I was teaching in St. Louis, and this was one of my first actual successful watercolors that I actually put into a show. And it's a watercolor and pencil and charcoal mixture, and then I took an X-Acto knife and scraped even things off, and it's called the Hazer Rig place because that's the name of the barn. That's the name of the farm we bought. It was owned by Hazer Rig, long gone, and that barn was collapsing, and Susie's dad and I jacked up that barn and rebuilt it, and so that's always my wife keeps this one because it's sentimental to her, because she remembers that summer we was out there with railroad jacks. Where's that located? Northern Missouri, just north of Jamesport. Okay. Okay, that's where my wife is from. And the final piece of work we have is back around here, and it's called Harlequin. It's a clown. One of the projects we had early on, and again, this is breaking down into a cubistic thing to break into flat planes, learn to control the paint. But the idea of a self-portrait implies somewhat that you are a clown. You have one face that you see for you and one face that you show for the rest of the world. And so that's why Harlequin is the name of this, and that's what it implies. It's not a very good self-portrait, but because it became more of a study of breaking down in planes, but it was an exercise, and it turned out to work.